There's much to talk about. Let's get straight to our panel. Joining us from Tampa is author and commentator Dan Perkins. With here in Washington is James Early, an activist for U.S.-Cuba relations. He served as Director for Cultural Heritage Policy at the Smithsonian Institute Center for Folk Life and Cultural Heritage. He's also been to Cuba so many times he's lost count. Arian Castaneda is a president and owner of a family business, a fourth-generation cigar maker. He immigrated to the United States from Cuba about 6 years ago. And joining us from Havana is Cuban journalist and commentator Cristina Escobar. Cristina, I'm going to start with you first. You know, I was with you in Havana, I seem to remember, when then Secretary of State John Kerry re-established diplomatic relations. It was an emotional day back then for so many people, all the way going back to 1961. How is Havana feeling right now?
Well, first of all, extremely hot. I mean, we are living this summer very intensely. But definitely, like that day in which we were together when John Kerry came in August 2015. But definitely about the Trump speech, in general, there's a lot of rejection and a lot of emotional answers, because Donald Trump, even if we separate the real actions from the rhetoric that he used today, is probably one of the most hostile rhetoric that we've heard about in the last, I don't know, even worse than Bush, we could say, in this sense. Even though the actions may not be as strict as to say that he is actually reversing everything Obama did, he couldn't do it because there's a lot of resistance, internal resistance around that. But here in Havana, well, Trump used a lot of symbolic figures which are very questionable for Cuban history. He called heroes what we believe are people that murder people here, essentially in the Bay of Pigs invasions, and used a lot of this historical sense. And for my generation, I'm 29 years old, for my generation, this has nothing to do with our present. We need and we want a normal relation with the U.S. We grew up listening to American music and watching American movies, and that's part of our reality. And of course, President Obama, even though he did not remove the embargo and still a lot of restrictions were around, in that sense, he created a sense of respect, a sense of trust, which Trump has definitely erased today.
Interesting. Let's just hear a little bit more from U.S. President Trump, because he's really lasering in on sort of economics. Let's have a listen.
To the Cuban government, I say, put an end to the abuse of dissidents. Release the political prisoners. Stop jailing innocent people. Open yourselves to political and economic freedoms.
So that seems, Cristina, let's stay with you, because it's good to have insight from Havana. That seems like a bargain, doesn't it? Human rights for economic opening up. What do you think is going to be the reaction from the Cuban government in the days and weeks ahead?
Well, the experience is very clear, Nathan. Cuban government and Cuban people in general, we do not answer right to pressure and conditioning. And there's a history in Cuba about being very strong and firm and keeping on our own path without giving in the pressure of the United States governments, different governments, because we've been under different governments and presidents with different approaches. But definitely the government is not going to answer well to this. At least it's not going to do what Trump's saying, because definitely that's not the approach to go. Dialogue, respect, principles, sitting on a table like equals, not imposing, all of these things which are diplomatically correct in the sense of talking to any government, but specifically to the Cuban government, and definitely that doesn't seem to be the approach of President Donald Trump. Probably we will see a declaration of the Cuban government about this, and he's probably going to answer a lot of this, because something that we've seen with Trump, which is different from the past before Obama, is that we gave Trump, and we see it in the media treatment, we saw it in the government treatment, which we gave him the benefit of the doubt to see what he was going to do, and listening to the actions and not to the words. And even when Fidel Castro died, and he had very disrespectful tweets about this tragedy, which was a tragedy for the Cuban people, still the government waited to see the actions. But today, it's very clear that the path is going to be this, the path is going to be hostility, even though the embassies are open. Nathan.
Let's get a different view, not too many miles north of you, in Tampa, Florida. Dan Perkins, you see this very differently, right? You see this Trump policy as something that he promised in the campaign, What do you think the effect is going to be? Do you think it's going to have the desired effect?
Well, I think it's going to take a while to get it to happen. It's going to take, as Marco Rubio said in his introduction of the president, it could take 6 months, it could take 6 years, but he believes that Cuba will be free. I think that a couple of things that aren't mentioned that affect the Cuban people. We Americans don't understand that many of the restaurants, the hotels, and all the tourist attractions are owned by the military. And when Trump talks about stopping money to the military, most people don't understand that a person who works in a restaurant may be required to give 90% of their salary back to the military. How do they have a quality of life if they're getting pennies on the dollar in terms of what they're earning? I just think that there are issues that we can influence. For example, Trump says he wants the ships to be able to come in, but he wants to restrict individual because he wants to make sure that we can get people in and the local entrepreneurs get an opportunity to make a living.
Arian Castaneda here in the studio, you're Cuban. In private business. Is that something that resonates with you, that the reason that they're cracking down on tourists in this Trump new reversal of policy is because there is significant interest of the military and intelligence services in tourism? You're shaking your head.
No, of course not. I think there is more like their own personal interest than what they're really saying, right? Those people that work on the military-owned hotels, that actually having a decent kind of lifestyle in Cuba, right? And not just the people that works there. There is so many people that own their own restaurant called Paladares.
They're very good. I've been to many.
The best food you can find there. There is so many people that actually renting their house through Airbnb. Those money don't go through the government. Those money actually go directly to them. So when you restrict the flow of tourists to go to Cuba, you're actually damaging the Cuban people economy, not just the military economy.
James Early, this was dressed up and sold as basically a human rights policy. Some have scratched their head and said, well, we could just get back from Saudi Arabia where women can't drive cars, et cetera, et cetera. What's behind this, do you think?
Well, I think this is typical bombast from Trump, typical contradictions. The first human rights assault in his bombast today is against United States citizens who should have a right to travel any place in the world. What are we being protected from? What is the fear of a country of 300 and some odd million people visiting a country of 11 million people? Will we see something other than what is being presented in a distorted way by Trump?
You mean no Starbucks, right?
No. Well, Cuban coffee is even better than that.
Yeah.
I think the other contradiction, and a lot of contradictions in the bombast of Trump today, first and foremost at the Manuel Artima Hall, these are people who bombed Cuban hotels, killed visitors from other countries, attempted to assassinate the president for many years, poisoned food crops. These are terrorists tied into the CIA. And so this is where he goes with this very small little group that does not represent Cuban Americans. 84% or so of Cuban young people in the Florida area want to see normalization of relations. 75% of the U.S. population, including Cubans, want better relations. So I think this is a sleight of hand. And finally, keeping in mind that there's a contradiction in the Trump administration. He comes out with this bombast, really conditioning two factors. One is people-to-people travel, and the other is no relationships where the military is involved in the economy. But everything else, the other 23 measures that are already in play, the $6 billion that's already in play, the meetings that will be held today in Miami and was held yesterday with Central Americans on security issues, this is fiction, this is farce. And so he cannot alter the policy. And the Cuban government is not going to take well to this. They've been very clear, as has been pointed out. You treat us with respect, we are willing to debate you about anything, but you will do it respectful. And so Raul Castro has said, without haste, without pause. I think we will see that there will not be haste and there will be a lot of pause.
I want to bring Dan back in here because Raul Castro announcing that he's going to step aside. A lot of the embargo or blockade, as the Cubans would call it, language in Congress has said that we will not lift this until the Castros are out of power. Isn't this kind of interesting that Trump is reversing the Obama policy just as the Castro period is coming to an end?
Well, part of the challenge for Mr. Trump is whether or not the people who are going to replace Castro are clones or are they totally different people. Keep in mind, if diplomatic relations were so important between Cuba and the United States, why didn't either of the Castro brothers greet Obama when he arrived in Cuba? Why did Fidel Castro write a 1,500-word letter condemning the president as he left Cuba? How does that create positive relationships? I think it was really forced more than anything else by the Obama administration because they didn't have a foreign policy victory in the entire 8 years. And he thought Cuba would be an opportunity to do that. But he certainly wasn't well received by the Cuban government when he came here for a state visit.
Cristina,
who would have thought that the first president in 50 or 60 years would be snubbed at the airport by the leadership of the country?